Okay. So Ed is here, at least in spirit.
Hello, I don't know why my camera is not working. It was working when Nevit was helping me via Discord. So I don't know. But hey, thank you for I'm really excited about this and glad we're starting a uh new part of our journey and with Hume.
Ed um, is a poli sci professor at UT. I mean at Texas State, and Ed Luis is a professor in the language arts department. He knows Jason, so Jason directed him toward us,
Oh, excellent.
and Noah's a student. So okay, so I'm sorry, I kind of put a damper on the discussion. Um, so I don't know, where should we start? Should we start with the impressions and ideas, or
Yeah, it's a good idea.
the original ideas?
Yeah. Uh,
So what are impressions? What are ideas? How are they related?
and, what I found interesting is that he calls impressions not only the sensorial perceptions, but also what we would call emotions. He says love, hate, any feeling. So that's not, I don't know how. And that was sort of surprising.
So I think in my reading, impressions are just any immediate, direct, in the moment experience, whether it be from your five senses or from your internal experience.
Yeah,
And so,
internal, yeah,
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 he's at least when he's being careful, I think, um, when he's being really careful, he's agnostic about where these things originate from. And
yeah,
so the initial distinction is just intensity.
yeah, intensity. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, intensity. Yeah,
So like right now, I'm feeling a little anxious. That's an impression because I'm feeling it right now. And I'm
yeah,
seeing you guys on the screen. That's also an impression.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, he also relates it to a present object. I noticed that is the temporality of it is the present, and it's a presence of an object. That's what sensation gives you. And though I think in a lot of ways he ultimately kind of questions the idea of an object as a kind of integrated thing.
yeah,
But that's what in a sensory impression would be something like this kind of like like a mechanical intensity on your sense organs that gives you the presence of some object. And
yeah,
that's what that is copied and whatnot into ideas and
yeah,
yeah, all that good stuff.
yeah,
But then, like Louise said, the so-called internal impressions are,
yeah. Emotion. It's like they are
yeah,
not produced by yourself. It's very interesting how, I don't know, he has a certain idea of, well, he doesn't talk about consciousness or ego or but it's like it's something, although it's internal to yourself, it's like you don't produce them. You perceive them, but you don't produce them. That's what I meant. That's what surprised me.
I think he's being agnostic about the origin of things, the origin of these impressions. So, like in my present experience, I have certain mental perceptions Among them are
Hey,
really intense impressions, so the one's in my five senses and one's not in my five senses. But at least on my reading, and some people might disagree with this. I think when he's being careful, he's trying to avoid assigning a an origin to these things.
Okay.
He's describing experience. I think he's being more descriptive, and he's saying this is the way I
Yeah,
experience the world. I have these impressions.
yeah.
I think in a way the the sort of like question of origin is kind of technically nonsensical to him.
vámonos.
It would be
Hey, vámonos.
Vamonos. Where are we going?
Where? Oh, my bad. I didn't mute my mic.
Yeah, where was okay, Vamonos. Okay.
You're saying the question of origins is problematic.
Yeah, I think the sensory impression he's saying is like that is the ultimate origin, and any origin outside of that uh is either literally nonsensical, as in it's not making a sense impression, and it's some kind of a fiction of the imagination, um, or something kind of derived indirectly, which is also probably just a fiction of the imagination, and according to these principles of association and all that. So it seems like he doesn't there is an interesting thing about him, but, he talks in a very, traditional uh 18th century way, but he doesn't have that kind of really Cartesian kind of thing going on of okay, yeah, there's the ego as this kind of encapsulated world of experience, and then there's this whole problem of access in a way that sort of exists, it seems like, for Hume, but almost as a kind of somewhat as a secondary concern. And really, there's kind of all these things are on this kind of plane of sensory impressions first and foremost, and that's his criteria, that's his presupposition, and you either make sense according to it or you don't. And I think that's his starting place in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Does that uh
I think
correspond to other people's ideas of
that
what's
helps
going
me
on?
understand something that I noticed at the beginning, because the beginning is that he wants to criticize metaphysics. And I was wondering what author does he intend to criticize? And maybe his intention is to criticize Descartes, as you said. So that makes sense. Yeah, he doesn't talk about the subject or the ego. He talks about, empirical perceptions. So I think that makes sense.
I think he's critiquing Descartes, but I also think by extension he's critiquing the bulk of the Western metaphysical tradition, because like there's that one, where is it, on page 11 maybe, or I'm sorry, I'm using this Hackett edition, but he says,
Do you have the section and paragraph number
yeah, let's see, this is section 2.
of the original? Yeah.
Now I'm trying to find the paragraph.
Should have the number.
Okay, so this is, I'm trying to find, there's a place where he says, where he's complaining about philosophers and say, if we can't find any impression, maybe
Oh, yeah.
it's not
I
in
think
this,
it's at the end.
at the end
It's
of the,
the paragraph 17. When
yeah, that's that,
when
yeah,
we
the very last paragraph in that
when we
section.
entertain, therefore, any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need to but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived.
Yeah, and I think that's a critique of the Western metaphysical tradition
Yeah,
in general,
in general, yeah,
that we've manufactured lots of words that just don't have any real
yeah,
meaning.
yeah.
Technical
He
vocabulary.
probably started that, right? Because then, I know Derrida claims to be the critique of Western metaphysics, and then I was reading Kant, and he critiques metaphysics, and everyone critiques metaphysics, but it would seem that Hume is the first one.
Yeah, and so Nietzsche was very much carried through the critique of metaphysics pretty far, but he was influenced by Hume, interestingly enough, and he also uh, really centers on causality as part of this metaphysics. So it's interesting to see those connections there with Hume, Nietzsche, and then this kind of critique of metaphysics going all the way to, yeah,
Mm,
Derrida and
yeah,
whatnot.
yeah,
I want to throw in that Hume's Hume's attack on traditional metaphysics in many ways is going to be echoed like almost verbatim by Kant. It motivated for the same reasons and with the same kind of project in mind. And the way Hume articulates it, when he adds more, it really, for me, it puts it squarely within Enlightenment thinking. Like,
yeah,
why is Hume, why is Kant motivated to kind of critique metaphysics writ large? Because of all of the superstition and dogma and all
mm,
the mess that religion and doctrinal approach to religion has gotten us into. We've got to be skeptical and like shave away all those unwanted beliefs.
yeah.
That's what Hume is doing. That's what Kant is doing.
But I'm sure you, I mean, I don't think you meant this, but not only from religion, but just philosophy in general. Because I think, for example, Hume would be very critical of substance ontology, right? Like there are these underlying substances that have
Yeah.
superficial accidents. And that goes back at least to Aristotle. And I think, Hume would say all you get are the superficial, so-called superficial secondary qualities. That's all you get. You don't get you
Mm,
cannot possibly have an impression of a substance that lies underneath the sensory impression. So I think, I think Luis is correct. I mean, after Hume, if metaphysics was supposed to be what is the structure of the world, not processed by human cognition, but what is the structure of the world in itself? I mean, that had been problematic forever, but it's like Hume really points out how you just can't get there. And so it's just, the problem after Hume is, well, what can you even mean by metaphysics? If metaphysics is supposed to be the ontological structure of the world apart from human cognition, and Hume's like, but all you have are your mental impressions. You can't get there. So then what is metaphysics? And those of us who are familiar with philosophy in the 20th century, there was a resurgence of this of view. You can't do metaphysics. People tried to do metaphysics, and then in the logical positivists say you can't do it. So, shut up, stop using those words. They don't mean anything. And so, it's like Hume sort of crystallizes this problem, I think. And then, like Eric said, then Kant's like, well, okay, so now what?
mm,
I do have a question. I mean, it's a little bit sidetracking from the impression things, but regards of his, I guess, relation to metaphysics, because I understood as well, he's against it, but then he makes at the very beginning. So there's a point that it seems a little bit, not uncertain, but the thing is a bit ambiguous. Like he makes this metaphor, I guess, or he compares it to he makes this example with the painting and the anatomy. So it seems like he's trying to sympathize in a way. So as the practical, moral, ethical philosophy for him is the painting, and then the speculative metaphysical philosophy is the anatomy behind it. If the painting, for instance, is a human figure, so maybe the anatomy is not what makes the most effect in the practical sense, but it's something that benefits it in the practical rules to live a good life or something. So this is what I'm not certain, or maybe I understood wrong, but there's some parts that it made me think that it has some ambiguous view. But then again, it does comes back, and he say that we shouldn't despise metaphysics, but as long as we don't take it as as long as we understand it as it's just the exercise of curiosity, and it's pretty much not something that we can arrive to truth and knowledge with. I don't know. Did anybody sense this ambiguous?
Do you remember what paragraph it was the
It's
painting?
at the very beginning. I also have the physical copy. It's whenever he speaks about the two species of philosophy.
Oh yeah, in the beginning, the first section. Yeah, that's.
And it's funny how I say that a lot of speculative philosophers are probably gonna get forgotten, and he names a few, and they're super famous, while the opposite, the practical one, I don't know, I never heard of.
I was tickled by that.
I can't find there's a particular sentence, I think it's in that same section, where he talks about himself when he's acting as a philosopher, and then and then he uses the word an agent or actor or something like that. So in other words, he makes a distinction between when he's acting as a, to put it, when he's wearing his philosopher's cap, as opposed to when he's acting in the world, and when he's speaking as a philosopher, he's much more rigorous, much more careful. And I think that's when all that skepticism about metaphysics comes up. But then he's like, you've got to conduct yourself in the world, and you've got to interact with people, and you've got to figure out how to do that. And so when you're an actor in the world on a practical level, you've got to, you're going to assume that I'm walking around in a physical world with physical characteristics and all that, because otherwise you couldn't live. And I think maybe it's in his other big book. He says something, it's been a long time since I read it, but something like, when I'm being a philosopher, I'm going to be very skeptical about all this stuff. But when I'm playing backgammon with someone and drinking a beer, I'm gonna, I'm playing backgammon and drinking a beer. It's like, I'm not questioning about, these metaphysical questions then. I don't know if that's what you're thinking of, but he makes that distinction between how you have to interact in the world in a practical level versus as a kind of a critical philosopher.
But I mean, it doesn't seem like he's closing off that other species of philosophy, because he is making appeals of like, how do we allow it to reference the common, to reference life? Just let your science be human. Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still human, my translation. So I feel like he's still leaving a place for that thinking, but it does feel very much so like he's, wanting to like throw it back towards the day to day. And I like hearing y'all talk, and it was like hit me across the head of just, I think I read Kant's Prolegomena in the last year, and just the echoes of like having to limit reason. I don't know how much he uses the word reason, but to me, just like those echoes of like, we need to limit. and not to think so far out away from our experience. I do wonder, I haven't read other people like Locke and Descartes, but it makes me wonder, like, where does that critical attitude start? Hearing y'all talk about it makes it sound like, oh, Hume was quite original in kind of some of that skepticism, but I'm wondering, like, where does that thread get traced back to? But it felt very much like the sentiment I feel like I'm reading in this text felt so similar to Kant's Prolegomena in a way that is just like, oh, like it feels just like reading the same thing almost.
Yeah, I think what Hume is doing is he's setting up the practical, or what he calls moral, aspect of these things as primary, and the kind of abstract philosophical aspect is something that ultimately its criteria is met with in the practical social engagement ultimately, because so on a level of reason and belief and epistemology in these things, those aren't really consistent enough if you consider their own kind of field as the criteria. Ultimately, it has to be judged according to this necessity for social practical engagement. And I think that also would correspond with his ethics, and the fact that he wants to put ethics and morality really uh in that would be primary for him, I think. And yeah, so that's why there's that famous reference to, okay, I remember, so I was reading part of this earlier. He says something like, okay, what if I really totally go along with this idea? I have zero knowledge of causality or one thing following from another, any sort of predictability and order to my experience. Was just uh could I possibly do that? He calls it kind of like a delirium, a madness, melancholy. Um and then says the kind of the antidote to that is to hang out with my buddies and play backgammon. And some people take this to be a kind of, oh, well, that's like a very lazy answer. It's kind of like, oh, I don't know. Just go like drink a beer, play some video games. I don't know. But there's I think what he's doing there is actually it's that's based off his actual principles in philosophy, where he's putting the moral and the practical first. And that, so it's an appeal to that rather than a kind of, dismissive kind of giving up on trying to have some kind of consistent idea. It's really, there's two levels operating for him, and that kind of like purely epistemological sort of level is secondary to the necessity for practical social engagement, which I think I've said like 4 times now, so I'm going to stop talking.
And to go in a little bit of that, on page 28, there was two things I wanted to mention because you mentioned causality. On 28, I think this is section 4 or 5, he says, all inferences from experience, therefore, are the effects of custom, not of reasoning, with a footnote. And then further on, I think this is section 5 on page 33, says, let us take the whole compass of this doctrine and allow the sentiment of belief is nothing but a conception more intense and steady than what attends the mere fictions of the imagination, and that this manner of conception arises from a customary conjunction of the object with something present to the memory or senses. I believe that it will not be difficult upon these suppositions to find other operations of the mind analogous to it, and to trace up this phenomena to principles still more general. And I think in that section he's kind of hinting what you're saying, Chase, is he's kind of like setting the framework for like something bigger when it comes to the analysis of causality. Because when I was reading this section, he seems to be implying that like causality itself is not like an observable event. It's not logical in his mind. Like a when you measure something, there isn't something out in there isn't some discoverable object that you know that is causality. You are measuring something because of a practice or a habit or a custom. This is how we measure something. This is the repeat aspect. And he seems to be drawing a line in the fact that it's not inherent epistemologically in the world. Is that a correct reading of him?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
He said, if so we experience constant conjunction. We experience one thing happening after another, but we never experience the necessary connection, which is whatever it is that is metaphysically supposed to link cause to effect. So like with the billiard ball thing, what you experience is ball rolling, collision, loud noise, ball rolling, but you don't have any impression of momentum transfer. You don't experience that. Or, maybe more directly, this is something that, makes my students think I'm crazy. I say, are you experiencing gravity in itself right now? Like literally the force of, are you experiencing gravity in itself? And they initially say, well, yes, of course. And I say, so what do you experience with your five senses? Well, I'm stuck to my chair. I feel pressure in my butt. When I jump, I fall. And I say, but you're not, what you're experiencing are sensory phenomena. And then someone will say, oh, right, I get it. Those are the effects of gravity. And then I say, right. But what that means is gravity in itself is an inference. You're inferring that from things you can experience directly with your senses, you're inferring that there is this force of gravity that is responsible for producing that effect. But the only thing you experience immediately are weight, stuck to the floor, pressure in your butt. But those, you're not experiencing gravity in itself. And then as an illustration, what I say is if we could experience whatever causes things to fall directly and immediately with our five senses, if we really had direct access, then Aristotle should have been able to tell us that, because Aristotle would have been able to go, oh, look, there's that gravity stuff. But he doesn't. Aristotle says there's this, you've got earth, air, or say earth, water, air, and fire. And the reason things fall is because the earthy things want to be with the earth. Nothing about gravity. And then Newton comes along and says, well, there's masses generate these gravitational fields, which get interlocked, another image. But then Einstein comes along and says, no, that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is masses create these warps in space-time, and things fall into one another's warps. And the point, the point I'm trying to make is the reason the history of science is just a bunch of these theories, which get increasingly better able to predict empirical results. But the reason that they're so weird and different is exactly because we have absolutely zero immediate and direct sensory grasp contact with what he calls the secret powers that we attribute to causality in the universe. So the only thing we ever have immediate access to are sensory phenomena, and then we construct these theories and we speculate what's happening behind the scenes. But because we have no sensory access, we keep having to revise these theories, because things we experience no longer behave the rules of, this theory that we have of what's going on behind the scenes, as it were, in the universe. So, we don't experience any of the metaphysical causal forces or powers that our theories tell us drive cause and effect in the universe.
Which is interesting, right? Since it kind of like results at like it is accurate, like in a way, but I just find it interesting that like when we repeatedly see one event following another, we do kind of tie it to a custom or an expectation or a habit, and then kind of think, well, this is just the way it is. Like there's some axiomatic rule that is inherently accessible.
I think that that's important because that's a big thing that Kant's concerned with, right? Is the Hume's argument that we have no, I mean, Hume just flat out says we have no, that our belief in cause and effect is not rational. I mean, he literally says it's not rational.
Correct. That's the main point of contention for, for Kant. He's not gonna try to dispute Hume and say, oh no, causation is there in your impressions. You can directly experience it. You just didn't notice it. At one point, Hume even says, if you want to look for the necessary connection between cause and effect, look no further than us ourselves, who seem to put it there. Not quite a necessary connection, but the subject imposes the connection where all we really get from impressions is correlation or conjunction. And I think Kant is going to agree with that too. But yes, it's this, there in this, but he's gonna stress the necessity of it.
Eric, did you just commit philosophical apostasy with that faux pas?
Oh no, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
No, sorry, David, you were referring when you said that there's no reason in the relationship between cause and effect. You were referring to Hume. There's a paragraph 36, when he says, all inferences from experience, therefore, are effects of custom, not of reasoning. Were you
Right.
referring to that? Yeah. Yeah, but that's not, I don't mean that doesn't mean that it's not reasonable, but well, yeah, he says not of reasoning, but of custom. Yeah.
Reasonable in a probabilistic sense.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, that he even anticipates quantum physics, because for quantum physics, everything in the end is probabilistic. There's no inherent law or fundamental law. It's just probabilities.
But the problem with saying that probability is reasonable is you have to use probability to justify that
Yeah,
claim.
yeah,
It's a circular. I mean, that's, because if, like if you read,
yeah. I'm not saying that it's reasonable. The probability is reasonable, but yeah.
I mean, if you want to say, why is it reasonable for me to believe that things will continue to happen in the future the way they've happened in the past? Well, because that's the way it's always been. But right there, I mean, that's a circular argument. Things are going to
Yeah.
continue to be the way they have in the past because they've continued to be the way they were in the past. And so I think that's part of when he's saying it's not reasonable. It's just the best you can do is make a circular argument. And so
Yeah.
for him, it's just a matter of, it's a habit. It's just, and he literally says, if you ask me what is the cause, we only point out a principle of human nature. By employing that word, we pretend not to have given the ultimate reason of such a propensity. He makes no effort to explain why we have this habit.
Yeah, I think that's part of his critique of metaphysics, because he's saying that there's no inherent relationship between cause and effect. If you found something, that would be metaphysical, that would be beyond our sensory experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that makes sense. I mean,
But clarifying, does not Hume use the word reasonable a little bit looser?
maybe, yeah.
Well, when he says that, like when he says, what Louis just quoted, the principle is custom or habit, for wherever the repetition of particular blah, 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 without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we say it's custom. I think there he's thinking of reason in a pretty rigorous sense.
Yeah. Reason versus reasonable. I feel like
Yeah.
recalling moments where he used the word reasonable in more of a looser sense. But when he says reason and reasoning, I think that's in that narrow.
I agree.
Yeah, I was a little confused about that as well, because at times he seems to talk about reason kind of like what I would associate more with logic. And it's, the relations of ideas and analytic truths. It's kind of like that. But then there's also a kind of, maybe that's the reasonable, which is kind of like the more probabilistic kind of way of, there's still kind of like a regulative kind of aspect to the reasonable that does have to do with that probabilistic aspect. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure what uh where the distinction is or what it is exactly, but I don't know. Seems like there's
I
something
would,
going on there.
Yeah,
I would, I would refer it back to the one he makes in the first chapter, the one that Carmen was pointing out. With there's the two different types of philosophy, the two different ways of presenting philosophy, and one of them he relates. It reminded me of Gramsci, like common sense as a species of philosophy. And there's a whole lot of, the ones he said that would be remembered were more ones like philosophers of a common sense. You know what I mean? Appealing with poetry and images and examples and just kind of giving people a general guidance for life, you know. And then there's the academic, strict, rigorous philosophy, which a lot of people don't like because it's very abstract and obtruse and everything. And really, I see Hume as identifying himself like what he's doing right now is more the latter, right? And in this sense, when I'm doing that, when I'm doing this very rigid mode of pure like reasoning, that in this mode, like I'm, you know, causation is something I see as a really deep problem, and then when it comes to practical living and the common sense that we ought to live by, then look, your predictions of the future are kind of probabilistic based on your experiences of the past. That's pretty reasonable. Let's just run with that. Okay. But if you want to narrow in on what's really happening, like an academic philosopher would, then you're going to see the problem like I see.
Years ago, I looked at a little bit of secondary literature, and one of the complaints about, because philosophers still argue about this today, philosophers of science, because ultimately what he's doing is he's calling into question induction, scientific induction, which is the whole basis of empirical science. But one of the complaints that some people, echoing what Chase was saying, is that when in this more, I guess you could say in this academic sense, when he talks about reason, he's reducing reason to basically deductive reasoning. You can't deductively prove anything about causation. But then, like you said, in a practical world, you have to assume that probabilistic conclusions are reasonable in some sense. So
yeah.
It just made me smile. In section 5, it would be the second paragraph. It's a special solution of these doubts. It was just reminded me of something else we had read in a different arena. It's when he says nature will always maintain her rights and prevail in the end over any abstract reasoning whatsoever. And that reminded me of the line in Faust, all theory is gray, my friend, the golden tree of life is green. So that to me, that echoed what you all were talking about, tonight, which is, hey, we just have to make our way through the world, right? And let's make, I don't know if he would in this context use the word reasonable, but use our judgment and try to get along with people, and that's different from the philosophical endeavor.
Well, and even more so, I had to go back to the section 1. I can't remember where he says it, where like he says something along the lines of like, amongst all of this attempt at like understanding the pure, like where does he say this? Like you still remain human. Like all of section 1 was borderline poetic because he seems to kind of like be positing this epistemological humbleness when it comes to the limits of what we have access to, which reminded me a lot of what you just said. I'll see if I can find that section because there were some really good parts. Oh, here's one on page 6. The only method of learning at once from these abstruse questions is to inquire seriously into the nature of human understanding and show from the exact analysis of its powers and capacities that is by no means fitted for such remote and abstruse subjects. And he keeps going on to kind of like just set the stage for almost a materialistic or epistemological humility in a way.
Right.
I think the whole thing is, I mean, it's all he's really concerned about the limits of reason, you know, which is what Kant's big thing is too, right? I mean, he's really he thinks that philosophers have claimed they can give rigorous reasons for stuff that they just made up. So he's I think he is trying to he's trying to figure out what the real limits of reason are.
Can I ask a question? It would be right before part 2. Actually, that's probably not helpful because it's part 2 of what? Section 5. It would be the 3rd paragraph before part 2 starts of section 5. And it's the second half of the 3rd full paragraph, even though the first 2 full paragraphs are rather small, short. He says, in a word, if we proceed not upon some fact present to the memory or senses, our reasonings would be merely hypothetical. And however the particular links might be connected with each other, the whole claim of inference would have nothing to support it, nor could we ever by its means, and I thought that was a rather broad statement, nor could we ever by its means arrive at the knowledge of any real existence. If I ask why you believe any particular matter of fact, which you relate, you must tell me some reason. And if this reason will be some other fact connected with it, but as you cannot proceed after this manner in infinitum, you must at least terminate in some fact which is present to your memory or senses, or must allow that your belief is entirely without foundation. That reminded me of the way Socrates was having that conversation with the man who was suing his parents for being ungodly. I mean, I don't know. You all know Greek philosophy better than I do, but just the way he says you can, it's going to terminate in something about your memory or sense, or it's a belief that really has no foundation.
I think that what he's trying to explain is why he says that there's no relationship or no intrinsic or inherent quality in the relationship between cause and effect. Because if you have 2 billiards balls and they clash and one goes one way and the other one the other way, you can explain it saying, well, you know, there are molecules that, you know, they have momentum, and then that's the cause. Yeah, but then you could question, well, what's behind that? Well, there are atoms in those molecules, and so on. You could proceed ad infinitum trying to explain the relationship between cause and effect. And in the end, you will never get it. So I think that's what he's trying to do. I don't know.
I think you're right. You know, when I was reading some of these examples, you know, I was imagining someone would say, well, fine, they didn't know, the science wasn't aware of the way these things worked in his time, but now we know. But I think you're right. I mean, even if you take contemporary science, what happens is you just break down, like he says, for example, who knows how food becomes, you know, part of the body, and we say, oh, we know how that works, you know, we got all these answers. But then then he would say, okay, but let's look at digestion, and let's look at all that. And the more you examine it, all you do is you just create a longer chain
Yeah.
of cause and effect relationships, and you're never going to get to the power, the force, the energy, or whatever that links the one to the other.
To the ground.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, and I wouldn't, yeah, to add to that analogy, right? Like we have modern nutrition, but if it, if you believe, that eating brown rice is healthier than eating burgers every day, Hume is asking you to justify that belief. At some point, it's either going to be without a foundation, or you're going to have to point to some kind of present impression,
Yep.
which is, I can just tell you that, I can call up my memory. I used to eat burgers every day and I felt like shit. And now I've been eating brown rice every day and I feel less like shit. I feel like a rabbit, but less like shit. You know what I mean? Recalling to a direct impression as the ground of your reasoning.
So then he thinks we can't have, I guess, use it like a philosophy term, like we can't have a priori knowledge of cause and effect, right? We can't find that magical power or like secret power, whatever the term he uses. We can't reason to that. We can only then also go back to the thing of reasonable and reason. We can only be reasonable about that thing, but that chain of reasonability can be always appended onto as you discover more and more scientific truths, I guess, right? Like, is that sort of the thing that seems like to be the broad idea of what's going on here, at least in these first parts that we read,
right?
Which is why he critiques like religious or like religiosity, right? He's like all these people, like some philosophers will just say that it's the mind, but then they go the mind all the way down to God, and that's why he's critiquing them, because he's like, well, it's not, because I guess he doesn't believe in that, right? Or right, that's what's going on, and that's near the end, I think, or the end of the section that we read today.
And I mean, not to always bring this back to analytical, but it reminds me of the Wittgensteinian criticism in philosophical investigations, like where he says the machine contains a prophecy of some form in its future behavior. Like we get wrapped up in this this illusion that potentiality based off of like what we have observed so far inherently contains all future applications. Like there's causality is a form of like rule following or custom, as Hume is suggesting. It depends very, very much on how it is practiced and shared. And then there is a component of probability where it happens again, but public and how we go about measuring things. And it reminds me of the discussion he had with Turing when in the foundations of mathematics, or the foundations and history of mathematics, where like he made a similar argument with Turing, in that like when we start measuring formulas, it's because we have a particular custom or a particular procedure that we've used, and we feel that that is somehow an inherent axiom when it's really not.
Who did you say said that to Turing?
Wittgenstein in the history.
I didn't know they ever talked. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, he was the student. Yeah, the history of the foundation of mathematics, 1945. It's wonderful, wonderful. I feel like Turing must have gotten frustrated with Ludwig, like drawing like unicorns and questioning things on the board all the time. It's a great text. It's really good.
I think we should make new bingo cards for this round.
Oh yeah, yeah. I guess we haven't discussed Deleuze yet. I mean, he's come. Wait, have we? Chase, don't let me down. I'm relying on you.
Maybe Chase is in recovery. Don't trigger him.
Oh no.
So earlier I basically gave, okay, so Deleuze wrote a book on Hume, and earlier I basically gave
I
the
heard
argument
that.
to
I
the
heard
book,
that.
but I just didn't mention Deleuze by name.
You did
So
mention
there you go.
Nietzsche, though, so we got Nietzsche there.
Oh, good job, Devitt. Well done.
Was it in this section that he talked about matters of fact versus relations of ideas, or is that?
Yeah.
It was in this section?
It was like
the second
the
section.
second.
So that's what, when Noah was talking about a priori, I mean, I think this is actually difficulty for thoroughgoing empiricists like Hume, but he concedes that. Is that your thesis? Is that it?
Wait,
No,
you wrote it? Did you hold it up?
no, this is Deleuze's thesis,
Oh,
which he wrote on Hume.
Somewhere Alistair felt like a sense of great disappointment.
Here,
so
I
that
don't even see that.
oh, I did not know that. Huh.
I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, it was his equivalent of a master's thesis, which he wrote under Jean Hippolyte, who was a famous Hegelian, who I don't think we've mentioned today because
Yes.
someone
We
is
have
not
it?
here.
Hunter,
We have
Hegel,
it?
Bingo, Descartes. Yeah, like that's yeah. I'm only half joking about the bingo card.
Yeah, I'm totally down with
We
it.
got Aristotle, got Plato, we get but I was going to say the relations of ideas are things like he says arithmetic and geometry.
Mhm.
I think we could include logic. So the stuff you can deductively prove a priori. So you don't have to have any experience. You don't have to, as I say, you don't have to go do experiments in the world to prove the theorems of geometry. You can just sit and do, these axiomatic deductions. And he does briefly entertain the possibility that, well, maybe causality. I mean, I actually think Descartes thought causality was an innate idea, so that you could probably get at it a priori. But that, well, maybe causality is something that we already know inherently, a priori. Maybe maybe causality is like math, like geometry. But then the problem with that is if that was the case, then scientists wouldn't have to do experiments. They could sit at their desks and axiomatically work out, the consequences of all their experiments without having to actually do any experiments. Because, a pure mathematician doesn't have to go do experiments in the world. When Leibniz and Newton came up with calculus, they weren't doing any experiments. They were sitting and thinking and deductively generating these theorems. And if causality was something that we could know a priori, like math and geometry, scientists could do the same kind of a thing. They could say, well, we're going to plan on doing this, but instead of having to build this multi-billion-dollar super collider, we'll just sit and we'll just deduce what the consequences of this thing are going to be. But that doesn't work. You actually have to go out there and do the experiment. So causality is not something we can know a priori without experience.
The Zoom chat's really not worth reading. We've devolved into butt jokes. So.
I approve of Eric's effort to require a little bit of spelling and grammar rigor.
We're true intellectuals.
He does, however, tell us where he thinks the idea of necessary connection comes from. See, this is on page 50 in this edition. It's part 2 of section 7. The one, two, third paragraph. So one of the things he could do is he could say that that necessary connection or power, this thing that we believe connects cause to effect. We have no sensory experience of it. We have no impression of it. So he could say it's an empty or vacuous idea. Like, I think he would say the idea of substance, the thing that underlies the sensory properties. the underlying substance, I think he would say is a vacuous or empty, meaningless idea because you can't get an impression of it. And he could say the same thing about necessary connection, that it's a vacuous and empty and meaningless idea, but he doesn't say that. In this paragraph, he says, it appears then that this idea of necessary connection among events arises from a number of similar instances which occur of the constant conjunction of these events, nor can that idea ever be suggested by any one of them, one of these instances, surveyed in all possible lights and positions. But there is nothing in a number of instances different from every single instance, which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. So he actually gives us he gives us a account of where he thinks the idea of necessary connection comes from. It's not an empty, vacuous idea. He actually says we do have an impression that generates this idea. Which is a little surprising given all he said about it prior to this.
Yeah, I found that curious too. I'm thinking that like what he's doing here, he's kind of saying what we call necessary connection is actually just a misdiagnosis of a reasonable and intense feeling that this will follow, right? Because he's disputing the necessity of it. Strictly, there's no necessity there. But it's not for nothing that we feel as if it were a necessity.
Yeah, I mean, I think so we see one thing happen and another thing happen. And if it's the first time, we would have no idea that the two were related. Then we see the same thing happen and the same thing happen again, and then again, and then again. And pretty soon we begin to just habitually expect the one to follow the other. And again, he claims that's not reason there. It's just a habit. It's just a feature. He literally says it's a feature of human nature, a species of instinct that we just automatically, for reasons he's not willing to speculate on, just assume that these things are going to keep happening. But once it's happened enough, when the first thing appears in the imagination, I am already imagining that this next thing's going to happen. And I misinterpret that anticipation of the next thing happening as if that were the power involved or the necessary connection. And that is an impression, but it's an internal impression. It's not anything I get in my five senses. It's literally, he thinks, a feeling in the mind, the feeling of anticipating that this next thing is going to happen. Just because I've seen it happen so many times, I just automatically begin to feel the next thing simply has to happen because it's happened every time. So it's got to happen. So that's what I think you're right. It's a miss diagnosis, or like I said, we misinterpret this internal feeling of transition of the imagination as if it were feeling a real power or the real necessary connection between the things.
Would do you think that this would apply to potentiality, potentiality as experienced within the self? So, like, say you're sitting there and you're contemplating what you're going to do next, like maybe you have a bunch of stuff to do for the day, and you're trying to decide what you're going to take up first. So there's that kind. The Gadamer discusses Plato's discussion of dunamis, which seems to me is what Hume is discussing here as the secret powers is dunamis. Maybe not specifically, but it's what it reminds me of at least. And when Gadamer discusses it, he discusses it as a a self relation. So this internal, well, if we consider the phenomenology of dunamis based off of Plato's description of it as a self relation, then it would just kind of you would feel it as a and the way that you become aware of it would be as a well, in its effect maybe, or as a potentiality before, prior to the effect. So it's just kind of like it's something lying and waiting. I'm not sure how to put it into words because it's such an abstract concept. But yeah, so would this be kind of the same case for Hume, maybe with potentiality, not potentiality external to the self, but one's own possibilities.
I'm guessing that Hume is hitting on this core idea of the lack of that concept we have of cause and effect, and the future replicating the past in similar conditions is very human. And I think that gets to also, but why do we have a need? And that's the only way I would use the word necessity connected to Hume. Why does it appear that humans need this sense of continuity of what we call the replication of B follows A? And it seems to me it's we don't want to think we live in a contingent world that has no meaning.
I mean, I wonder if you could, I mean, Darwin came 100 years later, roughly, but what Hume says, I don't know why we do this. It's a species of instinct, and animals, I mean, obviously animals demonstrate, behavior. They clearly have a sense for cause and effect, and they're not rational. I mean, even the simplest animals have causal behavior, and they're not thinking about anything. And my thinking is that if 100 years later he might have been able to use evolution as an explanation, that if there were animals who had no causal mechanisms in their biology, and animals who did not develop any feeling of like this, they simply would have taken themselves out of the gene pool. They would not be here anymore. And so that the instinct, causal mechanisms, and this instinct of believing that things in the future will behave like they are in the past is an evolutionary adaptation. That's my guess, is that, I mean, if Hume had been around 100 years, he might have said something like that.
Speaking to that very point, I found the very end of the 5th section of kind of addressing this in a curious fashion, in a way that, again, probably predictably, my mind goes ding ding. This is something Kant and Hegel are very much going to exploit, right? But the last goodness, it's a longer sentence, but it's the last sentence of that section. As nature has taught us the use of our limbs without giving us the knowledge of the muscles and nerves by which they are actuated, so has she implanted in us an instinct which carries forward the thought in a correspondent course to that which she has established among external objects. Though we are ignorant of those powers and forces on which this regular course and succession of objects totally depends. So, this need, like what Ed was, this need to find, to deploy habit and custom to kind of be able to predict the world and negotiate it. Nature has given us this instinct to do it. And then mysteriously, this instinct that nature has given us also corresponds to what nature has given to external objects.
But Hume doesn't have any explanation for that.
No, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think Kant and Hegel will exploit that, right? Like, not in a kind of like, oh, you're so bad, Hume, you got this way wrong. But like, no, quite a lot of what Hume is saying is right here. There's some things we're going to contend, and the one of the ways of doing that is like, how do you make sense of this then? Really, no, but really do deep, drill down on this, and you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So what is Hegel's explanation for that self-consciousness negativity of the subject and its negativity is the substance of the negative dialectic?
And yeah, I'm not prepared.
Self-consciousness, yeah. Something like that. I think that's right. Yeah. But yeah, so a better philosopher than Hegel, Deleuze, he uses Hume and his first synthesis of time and difference repetition, which I think is kind of going at what y'all are getting at, in that so it's habit and it has to do with this kind of contraction of different cases of repetition forming an expectation, and that leads to this formation of a present, a living present where you have expectation of a future and the retention of a past. Um, so, and this has to do with kind of like all organic life. It's not just a human thing. So I think the way that you're talking about, like, this evolutionary kind of aspect of animal life and whatnot, that it extends to that. I think that's definitely what Hume is getting at also, and saying that, yeah, this is a kind of a passive synthesis that is not just in the active thinking of the human mind, but instead it's in organic life itself, as this is what generates expectations, and this is what is, kind of, that's what we're normally experiencing, and it's also generating these passions and drives and instincts and all that good stuff. So better explanation than self-consciousness, which is like, who cares about that? I don't.
It's good we're not in a physical room together. We could bet on. Let's see. Yeah, Hunter's not here to help Eric out, but Luis mentioned Descartes, and I think I think Hume has the entire tradition in mind, but I think he also has Descartes in particular in mind. He mentions Descartes specifically later in the book, and for this kind of thing, Descartes generally invokes God. Like, well, of course, God made it this way because God's a nice God and wants us to be able to survive in the universe. So of course God would implant whatever we needed to make it all work out. But Hume famously refuses to go that direction. When it seems to me, when Descartes gets to a place where he gets stuck, he wheels in. I mean, Hume actually mentions this somewhere in here. He uses the Greek term, but the God machine. Descartes kind of wheels in the God machine and say, "Well, God explains this," and Hume's like, "Well, I mean," instead, Hume's just like, I don't know," which, I mean, I find kind of admirable that instead he's going, "I don't know why this works this way. I don't know." Yeah, God, don't get me started. You guys know my history.
I was actually trying to get you started.
We never do that, Chase.
I feel just like being an agitator a lot these days, if you haven't noticed. Yeah.
That's what happens when you read too much Deleuze.
Yeah, exactly. I blame Deleuze. Actually, it's really Hegel's fault, which is another way of saying it's Hunter's fault.
Yeah,
There's another way of saying it, maybe it's God's fault too.
Well, God made Hunter. I mean, so,
Exactly. Yes.
I mean, if God made Hunter, oh my God, what does that say about the world?
I feel like you're really
Yeah, I think we're
here.
led to Schopenhauerian conclusions based off that.
So just a warning. So if some of you are absent sometime, you know what's going to happen. We're going to say bad things about you. But we just say bad. No, actually, we say bad things about Hunter even when he's here. So
It's
it,
true. Yeah.
it doesn't really matter.
But is there really a good and bad? Really?
We're beyond that.
There's a beyond good and evil, but that doesn't mean that we're completely beyond a good and bad.
That seems arbitrary.
So says Nietzsche.
So I think I could ground that in a kind of Spinoza's Nietzschean kind of synthesis, um, which I've done on Discord before because I can write on Discord, but that's the only place. But
And you're not going to rely on habit?
oh no, I have to. We all have to. Which that's part of good and bad would be these kind of like primary, okay, you've got impressions, sensory impressions. Those generate something like pain or pleasure. And then that generates then these secondary drives of desire or avoidance and these impressions of reflection. And that's the basis of Hume's morality, is this kind of affective, passional sort of way of thinking about. They're still generating this sensory experience in the given of the sensory experience, but based off this kind of elaboration from pain and pleasure, you can get a whole ethics based off it, which I think is actually it's pretty Spinoza's, really.
Hume's ethics is?
I think so.
I
Especially
don't
that
really-
kind of that third and fourth book of the ethics, where he's talking about, pain, pleasure, the conatus, about how like different objects produce different affects. I think it's pretty similar to Hume's kind of idea about the way that passions and drives work with those sensory impressions and pain and pleasure. Somebody's probably has written something based off that. I don't know, I haven't looked, but maybe
I'm
that'd
sure
be
there's something there to exploit.
yeah.
But I want to say most scholars would the primary influence on Hume's ethics is the third Earl of Shaftesbury.
I don't think I've ever heard of this person.
I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about him.
He's like the OG moral sense theorist.
Ah,
Could you write that name in the chat?
Sometimes it's just referred to as Shaftesbury.
That's a interesting, very formal name. What even is it, Earl? Sorry,
It's a rank
have
in the
to-
old aristocracy. In Britain, the different countries are going to have different aristocratic hierarchies, but Earl, Viscount, actually the lowest level of aristocrat in Britain was Baron. I never think of Baron in the British context. I always think of that as continental. But yeah, Baron, Earl, Viscount, Marquis. I don't know. I don't remember all of them, but it's about midway through the hierarchy of aristocrats.
Didn't
he
I
know?
I need to learn more about this.
Eric, didn't he have some kind of connection to Locke? Was Locke reacting in somewhat because For some reason, when you said Shaftesbury, I said, "Well, wait, isn't?" I thought him and Locke, cross paths.
Yeah, I want to say they were nearly contemporaneous. I'm not quite sure what the exact relationship is.
He refers to Locke a couple times in here, doesn't he?
Hume?
Yeah.
He
Yeah,
does.
that's right. That's right.
Mr. Locke, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can very much, I guess this is like basic, right? Basic Hume, but he's picking up Locke's empiricism
Yeah.
and running with it, its most radical conclusions.
Yeah, I think the part that where he's talking about power, a lot of that is kind of a reference critique of Locke's idea of power, which he puts a lot of stock in that we have some kind of sensation of power, and then he uses that to give some kind of like a notion of, I think, free will, I think. Can't exactly remember. I actually know that from when we read Whitehead and Process and Reality, because he refers to Hume and Locke's idea of power on several occasions. So I think I think Hume even does reference Locke in connection with that idea of power, where he's kind of giving his own sort of like, I'm being, me, Mr. Hume, I'm being more consistent with my empiricism and questioning this idea that power is indeed this empirical sensation. Like, I believe that's what Locke was saying. So I think, yeah, there's definitely this kind of, within the empirical tradition, Hume is definitely still kind of critiquing these people as well as elaborating on the kind of main traditional project and whatnot.
I think Hume is a more consistent empiricist than a lot of empiricists. And one of the things that constantly frustrates me about contemporary science is that I'm sorry, this is another soapbox. So some of you have heard this before, but that they say they're empiricists, but at the same time, they make claims about material reality that are not grounded in empirical observation. So, they, I mean, they don't pay attention to Hume's critique here, because they make these dogmatic assertions about what's really real in the world, so they think they're doing metaphysics because they're telling us here are the fundamental truths about reality, and we're discovering this empirically. And if Hume was here, he'd say, no, you're not. I mean, what you're doing is you're making these inferences that are, granted, in order to conduct a science, you have to construct you have to have these speculative inferences about what's happening, in a sense, behind the scenes of sensory experience. But don't tell me that you're being a completely consistent empiricist, because if you were a completely consistent empiricist, I think you would either do what Hume is doing and say, we're going to limit our proclamations to what you can have literally direct sensory experience to, or I think you could become some kind of phenomenologist, where you try to take a phenomenological uh, attack on science. But anyway, that's just one of my things. I think he's very, he's trying to be very rigorous, very consistent empiricist. And I think a lot of people who call themselves empiricists are not near as rigorous and consistent as he is.
Well, also you mentioned in the chat, Nevitt, which I think is very fair, that also Hume really is exhibiting humility, about what he honestly can know. I mean, don't follow the habit, don't follow the convention, but actually ask ourselves very serious questions about our knowledge and then what we don't know.
Yeah. So in about modern science and empiricism. So I read a very short article on Nietzsche and causality because I thought it was going to talk more about Hume than it did, but I mean it did somewhat, but it made the point that uh, it was it was critiquing this certain use of Nietzsche that was referring to him as a kind of naturalist, but operating in a kind of like natural science point of view, and even giving causal explanations of things. And I was saying this is totally dismissing what Nietzsche actually said about causality, which he, has in line with Hume also. So I think you could put Nietzsche in here with a kind of maybe a more consistent empiricism that is critical of this kind of uh, scientific methodology that is very reliant on this exact idea of causality that Hume and Nietzsche are questioning to some extent. In somewhat different ways, but still, they're both doing it.
No, I agree. There were several times in this when I thought, wow, that reminds me of Nietzsche. A number of times. One thing I thought maybe. No, go ahead, Eric.
No, I was gonna say the same thing. But with one important difference in that Hume seems to be a little bit more kind of explicitly pro-Enlightenment program. I think Nietzsche is more kind of implicitly a continuation of Enlightenment by critiquing Enlightenment, whereas Hume's just in it, doing it.
Is that so when you first said that, I was thinking that sounds kind of like Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, but then Enlightenment, maybe that's Adorno and Horkheimer.
I think a lot of people take Nietzsche to be continuing the mode of enlightenment to expel dogma, superstition, false belief, but to critique enlightenment's overemphasis on reason.
Yeah. And also critique the privilege of self-consciousness that you get in some philosophers.
Yeah, Nietzsche's is skeptical of a permanent self as Hume is, which will, if you read, well, I still wanted to say something about this reading, but then for next week, what's on the reading list is the second half of this book, but there's also a 2-page excerpt from Hume's chapter of personal identity which is from the treatise, and it's a longer. I forgot how long that chapter is. It's actually, a longish chapter, but the first 2 pages give you, I think, the essence of his argument as to why we have no reason to believe in a substantial self. But that's what I wanted to, at the risk of going into professor mode, but we haven't talked that much about ideas, because so Kant says there's these 2 perceptions, impressions and ideas, and then the empiricist thesis is you can have no meaningful idea that did not originate from an impression. So if you have an idea and you can't you can't either tag that idea to a specific impression or decompose it and analyze it into a collection of related simple ideas, all of which can be tagged to an impression. If you can't do that, it's a meaningless idea. And so, we have complex ideas which are made of simple ideas, each of which came from an impression or a memory of an impression. And so then impressions, at least in my reading, are just like they're more or less instantaneous. They're just what's happening now. And the mind, and again, this is something he does not try to answer as to why the mind works this way. He's just making these observations. The mind automatically converts all those intense, lively impressions into weaker copies, which are ideas. And then those ideas then move into memory. So every idea is a weaker copy of an impression or a collection of simple ideas that came from impressions. And so then our experience, I'm just saying this, based on things students have said where they kind of missed bits and pieces of this. Our normal experience is not with impressions. Our normal experience is actually with ideas. And so my life is a life of ideas, not a life of impressions, because the impressions, the primary function of impressions, maybe the only function, is actually to generate ideas, and they're very short-lived, and they produce these ideas, but then the ideas are what you can actually think about. So I think he would say you can't think an impression. You can think an idea that came from an impression. And so like what I'm experiencing right now is really a complex of ideas which came from impressions. And so that's anyway, at least that's my my reading of because like in the 2-page thing we're going to read next time, he says if you just turn your head, the impressions change, because you're being bombarded by these impressions constantly, and the mind's just cranking out ideas all the time that are copies of these impressions. And and then we're primarily living in this world of ideas and impressions, and a bunch of the ideas are ideas from, I mean, I don't even know if this part Hume says, I start sounding like Husserl, but we have past ideas and present ideas that are being generated by our impressions and probably anticipations of future things, and that's what makes up the content, our mental contents of life in the world, are all these ideas. So impressions, at least on my reading, impressions are not anything you can actually have. I mean, you can abstractly think about them. Like I'm thinking about an impression, but I'm not actually thinking about an impression. I'm thinking about an idea that came from an impression. So I don't
I
think
was
that, and that's, I say that because that's the way that ideas, the relation between ideas and impressions is important for understanding his argument as to why we have no meaningful idea of a self. Go
I
ahead.
was thinking about Husserl as well in this part of the reading. So it's good that you mentioned it. But do you think Husserl would say that uh, these the possibilities of an object are always already there? Uh, I think what Hume is saying is that what you get is the immediate impression, and then anything further is ideas. So it's like it's a further step. It's not already there. Like the like say you see a woman standing, your immediate impression is a woman standing, and then you start analyzing her outfit, or you think about where she's standing. Maybe she's standing outside of a classroom, so you imagine her to be, or you infer that she's the professor for the class, or something like that. Um, I think Husserl might want to say that those sorts of possibilities are always already there, and you yeah, they just seem like different moments. And I think Hume is more in saying that it's only what is immediately almost like at the first moment available, the impression.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right. I don't think Hume would say there's anything always already there, because he's being a rigorous empiricist, and he literally says every meaningful idea must come from an impression. And so, your mind can drag out of memory ideas that originate from other impressions. So, you can see this person, and I know it's a person because I've had experience of other persons, but all of that had to originate from experience. And I think he would also say, insofar as I'm thinking about this woman standing in the room, what I'm thinking about is the idea of the woman, not the impression. Because when I see this, I get a shower of impressions, and my mind automatically converts those impressions into ideas and automatically relates those ideas by, contiguity, resemblance, or cause and effect. And so my mind, the again, the only if my understanding of Hume is impressions do nothing but generate ideas, and then the mind grabs those ideas and relates them to one another in a bunch of different ways and relates them to ideas that came out of my memory. And that's how I understand that this is a woman. But it all depends upon having had impressions of something. And I mean, I suspect there's parts of experience that Hume cannot account for well with this theory, but that's my understanding of his theory. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that maybe this is even like a critique on or can be a critique on Husserl in like complicating uh an impression and and kind of smuggling in what is there and what is available. Seems like the imagination is just is always going to be an extra step. And I think Merleau-Ponty talks about the imagination as it being a sort of uh, an extra faculty that Kant doesn't discuss. If I'm recalling
No,
correctly, I'm not totally
that's
sure.
no,
Yeah, Kant
no.
says lots about the imagination.
All right,
Yes.
no.
Yeah. Heidegger, his reading of Kant is like all about the imagination. The imagination is the central
It's right in there.
ontological faculty or power of. I know it's like a controversial reading amongst Kantians. I mean, I think it is.
No,
But
well,
yeah, the imagination is pretty important for Kant and Hume as well. I think. I mean, I have a rudimentary understanding of both of them, but it seems like their ideas of the imagination are quite different from each other. Kant has like seems to have a very specific faculty of like what it's doing, and it's synthesizing the understanding and intuition, sensation. Where Hume, the imagination is kind of like that's the basis of the mind, really, is the images that come along with sense impressions, kind of like what Nev was talking about. And so it's kind of like the imagination is the collection of all these images, and it's formed also not only through these sense impressions, but then also you've got this kind of automatic, these principles of association that then sort of organize it in these ways to give it, relative stability and constancy. And that's how we think. So I think the imagination is kind of like that's what all these things take place in. But I don't know. I'm not a Hume expert, so I may be wrong.
I would respond to that quote real quick, or that line real quickly, Mario. I think Kant puts a heavy importance on the imagination. He look when in this when you'll see when we get to it when we get to the section on synthetic unity of a perception, right? There are components that go into this synthetic unity to make it a synthetic unity. Spontaneity and imagination are two of the main components. And when you understand the function of this synthetic unity of a perception and what it does for the rest of the work, then you see how spontaneity and imagination are always already in the activity of any thinking whatsoever.
So do you think it's right to say that the imagination in that sense would be it's what is synthesizing the different faculties together?
It's operating within the understanding, just within the faculty of understanding. It allows the faculty of understanding to do what understanding does, which is to bring intuition in relation to concept. Two heterogeneous things, how are they brought together? the faculty, the faculty of understanding relies on imagination to bring these two heterogeneous things into a relationship.
Sounds exciting.
And then there's the third critique, and how the experience of beauty relies on imagination, free play of the imagination and the understanding.
It just seems like every time you rattle off something else that Kant wrote, that he had a lot of time on his hands.
Well,
I find it. What did he do for a living? I mean, did they actually pay him for the first critique and say, and then the advertisements? Oh, if you like the first critique, the second one is even better. I mean,
yeah, he was a professor.
Yeah,
was he?
I remember he
Oh, okay.
taught like Leibniz and other rationalists or whatnot.
right.
Yeah, at the Königsberg.
Yeah,
Or-
yeah,
That's right.
yeah. That's the ancient capital of Prussia. Now it's Gdansk.
Kaliningrad.
Yes.
Is that modern day Russia or?
It's an enclave.
Yeah. Russia, the Soviet Union divided East Prussia between Poland and the USSR. And when the Baltic states and Belarus became independent, you had this outlier of Soviet territory on the Baltic. So Poland actually borders the Soviet Union. Yeah.
Didn't it take Kant like 10 years to write the first critique?
So there was a period of relative like quiet or silence. Like he came up as a student, he was doing his regular thing, and writing essays into competitions and things and going around teaching. And then there's like 10 years of kind of like nothing. And then he comes out with basically this critical project. And so it was kind of later in his life, and the last 20 years of his life were the critiques.
Wow. It was all in there festering.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was really, really wrestling with some problems, and coming up in the Leibnizian Wolffian school, then reading Hume and being awakened from this dogmatic slumbers, and then reading Rousseau and taking this freedom that Rousseau is championing, and this this enlightenment that's happening, taking that super seriously and trying to again, how do I reconcile all of this? How can I make sense that you've got a point, you've got a point, you've got a point? How do I make that all work? And then he does.
And was it not like a quite radical break from his earlier writings?
Yeah, it's seen as his critical turn, right? Or the critical turn. I mean, Kant's personal critical turn, which became Western philosophy's critical turn.
Yeah, so before he was focused on natural science and cosmology, right?
Well, he was an astronomer as well. So
Yeah,
the theory that stars are formed from condensed cosmic gases, that was our dude Immanuel Kant.
Wow. Did not know that.
Have you read the
Starry Heavens Above and Moral Law Within? He was seriously interested in both. Sorry.
So I can't remember what it's called, like the post what's the last book he wrote that or it's like the post humorous guy can't say the word. Basically when you're dead. Posthumous. Yeah, the posthumous work where he talks about I read some stuff about it. It seems really interesting because he was trying to that's where he's trying to connect the whole critical project back to a kind of natural material science kind of thing. He has to talk about like the ether and matter as a continuum of and all this. Some people are saying like, oh, it's like old Kant and he was dying and senile or whatever, where others are just like, no, this is actually a pretty interesting piece of work here. But I don't know if you've read it or are familiar with it, but it seems interesting. I don't know.
What was the title of it?
think that the posthumous work, or it's something like that.
Oh, okay.
I think I've heard comments more along the former of like, oh, he was dying, and you can clearly see that didn't have as sharp of a reasoning mind, etc. I haven't read it, but
People say the same thing about Ecce Homo or Ecce Homo.
I think they're wrong.
Yeah.
No.
Well, would anyone like to make any final comments or questions?
Just thanks for everybody's comments. I learned a lot.
Oh, Joey, did you? Yeah, was there something you wanted to? Looked like maybe you were like, okay. Okay, well,
Everybody is sufficiently aroused from their dogmatic slumbers now.
Mhm.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
totally. Yeah.
Mhm.
so I don't know. I guess since it's on the reading list, we've questioned whether the second part of this book is necessary, but
Yeah, I'd like to read it.
I think
yeah.
Yeah, me too. I would like to read that.
And the personal identity thing is important because Kant is concerned with, whether you can experience a self or not. Like if there's an empirically experienceable, stable self, and so I mean, and so is Nietzsche, and so is a lot of people. So I think, I maybe what I'll do is I could post. I don't want to do this anyway. I was going to say that I'm just giving you a 2-page excerpt. It's I don't know how long, 10 or 15, 12 pages. I don't know for the whole thing, but I think that 2 pages is enough. And I figured given that we're going to be reading like 60 pages in this book, then I didn't want to overburden people. And like I said, I think the essence of his argument is on the self is in that 2 pages. So hopefully that'll be adequate. Okay, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good seeing you, Chase.
Yep. Good seeing you.